So let's talk about permission. It's literally what it says it is. Do you have permission? That means the copyright owner has given you a document of some form that says you have permission to use my material. That may be a formal letter that's been printed and signed. It may be an email. It may be a Creative Commons license that you print off their site directly, or it may be something that you've obtained from databases within your university. Whatever happens, make sure that you keep track and keep a record, preferably in print form somehow, of each of the individual permissions, so that if you're ever challenged about, show me that you have the rights to this, you actually do have a documentary permission for that. What about, are you including any materials that you created that you previously published? So think about the fact that along your PhD journey, you have been fortunate enough to publish something in a journal, which is often the case, but to be fair, it's not the case for every PhD student. So it has been previously published. The chances are that during the process of publishing, you transferred the copyright of your material to the publisher. That means if that has happened, you don't have the right to reuse it, even though you're the person who wrote it. So you've got to be very careful. In this case, it doesn't mean you can't use it, but what it means is you may be faced with a situation that you have to approach the publisher of that journal or that book and ask them, the people who own the copyright, for the rights to reproduce the very work that you started, that you wrote in the first place. So this is not about, did I create it? It comes down to, do I have the correct rights and permission to be able to use it? So there's an important lesson with this. And this is something I think most of us learn along the way, because it's very easy to get bitten. Read and negotiate your publication agreements with care. That's the most important lesson. Okay, so when do I expect permissions need to be achieved? Very simple. If we're using long quotations from pre-existing materials, more than 1 1/2 single-spaced pages. So if we're taking the equivalent of greater than 1 1/2 pages from somebody else's work, we need to be able to get permission, because we're obviously using a considerable amount of what they have within the process. Reproduced publications. So examples include copies of standard survey instruments, questionnaires, or journal articles. This even applies if you are the original author again, because you may have given publication somewhere, copyright somewhere else. Now I think back to some of the theses and dissertations that I've read over the years, and some of the older style ones have actually literally included journal articles as word for word, including layout or typography, copies of articles that the person did partway through. It doesn't mean you're not going to get permission, but you need to make sure that's included, because that's the integrity side of things. A third one is unpublished material. If you have extensive reference to unpublished work, it can raise a variety of issues about copyright and also about privacy and access to private collections. So it's very important how we go about doing that. So in last week, when I talked about historical research and some of my own experience going through as an early researcher, I'm utilizing private collections of materials that at that time were unpublished. As such, in order to use them effectively, permissions had to be sought. We look at permissions for poetry and musical lyrics. So fair use for highly creative works is limited. So if we use lengthy excerpts, that may raise critical questions. Some publishers actually require permission for all quotations from poems. So even if you've taken one stanza, it's still something that you may be expected to be able to source and provide a permission for. If we take dialogue from a play, a screenplay, a broadcast, or novel, any music, graphical, pictorial works, software or computer software. So sometimes we have dissertations that are embodied in new media, such as on a website or on CD. These may incorporate reader programs or other application software to make the new work accessible or usable. So in this case, we have to explore permissions as well. Sources located on the internet. Now, it's not the be-all and end-all of getting information, but it's a convenient thing. The rule, though, is easy availability does not change the copyright status. Materials on the web are still protected by copyright as if they appeared in any other form. All that's happening is they are simply perhaps in a more conveniently accessible spot for us. And images of any form that have been obtained from copyright sources, so that's covered. Altering an image does not remove the need to seek permission. So say, for example, we do have a chart or a diagram that we have sourced from another researcher, and we've chosen to adjust it in a number of different ways. Now, this can be as simple as common alterations like cropping, resizing, modifying colors, annotating it with text, arrows, or other visual callouts. Or it can be more complicated that we are reworking and restructuring the image itself. It still requires permissions. Many of us think if we make enough changes to it, it will be seen as ours, not as theirs. But in actual fact, it is theirs that we have made ours. So again, permissions required. Keep in mind that just because it's there doesn't mean you can reproduce it. And the chances are, and here's a problem, if it is subsequently discovered that you do not have permission to use certain work, you may be required to redact that from your dissertation. So as you've printed and submitted your dissertation, you now have massive areas or significant areas of black, which take information out of it. Either that compromises the process of how you've come to your results, or it forces you to find alternatives to include, which may then have an implication on the strength of what you are saying with your arguments. Think also about material that has been co-authored with others. So during your research journey, you might do with either a supervisor or perhaps another researcher in your department, a co-authored publication. Now, because you're part of it, depends on what has happened. You may have assigned the rights or you may have kept the rights. But you now have a second author that needs to consent to the use of that work in your singular research, because that's without them. We also need to consider permissions for translations of copyrighted work, and also testing instruments such as standardized tests, questionnaires, forms, and surveys. So there's a lot there, not a very thrilling list in that respect, but it simply comes back down to the point that when we are making use of any form of text, image, communication from other parties, we need to keep track of the fact that they allow us to do so. Now, sometimes we've got to figure out who actually is the copyright owner, because it may fall with an individual, it may fall with a publisher, or it may fall with, say, a journal that's part of a university, for example. If the copyright owner is an individual, very simple. Email, write to them. Explain who you are, how and why you want to use the work, and request permission. The fact that you send an email message with a reply that says, yes, no problem, you have permission. It does not require you to take a particular format. It simply requires that they have acknowledged that you may use this in the work that you define. Now, here's the challenge. Hi, I'm approaching you because I would like to use image whatever for my PhD dissertation. Can I seek permission from you? Not the best well-written structure. I have just limited my use of that to my PhD dissertation only. So again, let's go back a little bit. We have to ask ourselves, what is the plan? Where do I foresee this being used? Will I be using it in my dissertation only, or will I be using it in my dissertation plus a potential journal article? So make sure you cover your bases, but be very honest with where you need it, because you don't want to go back to them and say, hi, me again. I found another thing that I want to use your particular copyrighted work for. Can I have permission for that too? It's better to get it at once, get the person to agree. Now let's talk about commercial publishers. So this is going to be journals such as that might be in the Elsevier range, or it may be from textbooks and manuscripts that have been published for commercial reasons. The fastest course of action for commercial publishers is actually something called the Copyright Clearance Center. Very American in its design, but effectively CCC handles permissions for large numbers of publishers. And in this case, permission to include images and theses can also be obtained through CCC very quickly and usually at no cost. So rather than writing to the publisher directly, go to Copyright Clearance Center, see whether you can seek permission for what you need through that. Now, some publishers may want you to submit your request directly to their permissions department. That's fine. Go through online form, get the results that come from it. But if you want to make it relatively easy, first try with CCC. And finally, we look at permissions from journals. So if the copyright owner is an academic journal or an association society that publishes a journal, for example, you may still be able to go through CCC, but if it is not available through there, then you need to go to that journal's website and you need to approach them directly. Now, I'm just going to point out, if permission to use copyrighted materials is given on a website, print it out or save an electronic copy of the web page that states this for your records. Saving a link to a permission is not going to be sufficient because you never know whether the link will break or the content of that particular website may change. So from a proof of permission perspective, keep copies of all letters and forms. These are your records. They don't go in your dissertation, but they go in the files that if you're ever asked, say, for example, even further down the track, you're going to publish through a journal or through a publishing house. You have everything ready to say that you can use it. Okay, so the best possible proof is usually a completed copy of permission to use copyrighted material forms. Now you can search these online and there's some great templates out there. You just get people to fill them out. Or an original signed letter from the copyright owners themselves. Okay, originals are best, scanned copies work also. Let's just move into a wrap-up part, which is citations and bibliographies. So this is making sure that you include your full citation for any copyrighted material. This should be obvious stuff for us, but the thing is, when we're putting in something that we've required permission from, we always need to acknowledge that permission has come into it. So with that, the by permission, adapted with permission, all of that reminds us and showcases to the audience that we've got that we've used this. You can have, I've just got a couple of pages of examples, nothing particularly mind-blowing here, but it's simply just about acknowledging that. Sometimes copyright owners will ask you to use a specific wording in your citations. So make sure that you follow those instructions word for words. Otherwise, just simply craft any citation you're making in accordance to your university and your degree program's preferred style guide. There's always going to be a style guide available either through your department or through your university library, and you can follow through with that. Now let's wrap up with something that's important for us, because chances are our thesis or our dissertation is not going to be the only thing we want to get out of this. We want to publish in journals, or perhaps we want to publish book chapters and so forth. So can I post my published journal article on open websites? So let's assume that I've published something. Now can I make it available? A published journal article is really a definitive final record that gives value add because of the publisher. Okay, they've done a different type of copy editing, formatting, pagination, all sorts of things to help your presentation. You can actually use your branded and formatted published article for all of the personal and institutional purposes you need. For example, you're teaching a course and you want to make that article available to your students. However, you've got to make sure that you safeguard. Some publishers are not going to make it available for you to publish, say, online on a blog that's open access. So it's very important to be able to think about where, in fact, you can publish. Now, I know this has been a very dry discussion. What I've wanted to do is to go through and talk about very specific points or very key elements that are important for us to consider. The challenge with copyright is not about, are we generally doing the right thing? It's if we are challenged by an examiner, if we are challenged by a publisher or a journal, can we make sure that we have protected the rights of others, as well as are we making the right decisions today to protect our own rights? So I've come to the end of my very long discussion. I thank you very much for that.